Good afternoon and welcome to our panel on education reform. We'll probably get more people trickling in from the outside. I'm Goodwin Liu. I'm a member of ALI, serve on council. Before serving in this role, I have been and still am Justice of the California Supreme Court. Before that, I was a law professor at UC Berkeley, specializing in these issues, education, law, and policy. I'm so delighted that you're all here this afternoon to hear a very A-list group of people talk very thoughtfully about the issues we face in our public schools. I want to begin just with an acknowledgement of the horrible tragedy that happened in Santa Fe, Texas. Seems appropriate to recognize that in a panel discussion about schools. School safety actually wasn't one of our main topics for today, but nonetheless, I know some of you even are here from the Houston area, and our hearts and prayers are with you. So for our panel today, we have a conversational format, and I'm going to go through some introductions and then give some just data points really quickly about sort of like a dashboard of where we are in education today, and get us grounded in a common set of materials. And then we'll have some discussion, maybe 30, 40 minutes among the panel, and some time left, I think, at the end for all of you to chime in as well. So let me first introduce our panelists just in order in which they're seated. To my immediate left is Nina Rees, who is the president of the, I want to get the name right, the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, and in that role, she heads the biggest nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing the charter school movement. Before that, she was a senior vice president for an organization called Knowledge Universe, which invests in early childhood education and before and after school programs. And before that, she did tours of duty in the government, including as the first deputy undersecretary for Innovation Improvement in the Department of Education under President George W. Bush, and also as a deputy assistant for domestic policy for Vice President Cheney. Sitting next to her is Ted Boutros, whom most of you here probably know. Ted is a partner in the LA office of Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher. He's one of the co-chairs of the firm's litigation groups. Ted is active in litigation in a whole bunch of arenas. He has probably gotten every recognition that is known to lawyering. But of most pertinent, of most relevance to this panel, Ted and one of his colleagues who's here today, Josh Lipschultz, sitting right over there, were involved in the Vergara litigation in California, challenging teacher tenure policies in our state. And they have also been involved in a Connecticut lawsuit asserting a fundamental right to education, which I think Ted will talk to us a little bit more about. And then sitting next to Ted is John King, who is the president of Education Trust. Ed Trust, for those of you who don't know, is a national nonprofit that focuses on the opportunity and achievement gaps in our public schools. Before that, he was our 10th U.S. Secretary of Education under President Obama. He was, prior to that, the Deputy Secretary, but even before that, he was the New York State Education Commissioner. King and John also got his start as a high school social studies teacher and a middle school principal. So, really great group of people to talk about these issues. I'm going to start with just a set of slides that I'm going to go really fast. And you can, if you want these slides, you can get them later. You don't have to take notes or anything. But just to get us onto the same page, and these will be familiar data points for all our panelists. So, let me advance to the first. So, just in terms of how our schools are doing on school achievement, let's look at that first. Here are some results from a international study called PISA, administered by the OECD over the last decade and a half or so. And this measures performance among 15-year-olds in 72 countries. And here you see the rankings of the United States in the three subjects that they test. It's too small to sort of see, but at the top of the list is Singapore in every subject. Several Asian countries are higher than we are. Some of the most improved schooling systems in the world include South Korea. You see the Scandinavian countries are usually up there as well. And there are some surprises in the top list too, including countries like Estonia and Poland, which measure up very highly on the PISA. So that just gives you a sense of kind of where we are relative to some peer and even not peer nations. Here's a chart of NAEP scores, the National Assessment of Education Progress, for reading. The only thing I'd sort of point you to is beyond the general notion that scores are modest in their incline over the years. Most of the incline you see has happened in the lower grades. It's been harder to move the needle at the upper grades, and you do see some significant progress among younger kids. If you look at math, it's the same kind of pattern. More progress among 9-year-olds, more stagnation, you could say, among higher grades. Here's a much more granular picture about how students are doing district by district throughout the country. This tells you, This tells you that where these students are in terms of grade levels above or below the national average. And you can see that the more blue they're doing, the more below they are, the more red or grayish or rust color-ish they're doing, the higher they are. So that's a good map to kind of get your orientation. How about the achievement gap? So by race, some modest good news. The racial achievement gap, reading and math, has been declining. Here's an interesting graph. Same idea here. Let me move on to this important study done by Sean Reardon at Stanford that shows you the increase in the achievement gap by socioeconomics. So the one I want to show you is really this one, where the dotted line represents the racial achievement gap and the dark line represents the socioeconomic achievement gap. And Professor Reardon's claim is that we are now entering a phase where the socioeconomic gap is getting bigger, even as the racial gap is getting smaller. Right? So the relevance of income and wealth is greater, he claims, in this period than the relevance of race. Okay, well, what about some of our special needs populations and demographics? Okay, so this is a graph that shows you from Gary Orfield's work on school desegregation, the percentage of black kids in 90% or 100% minority schools. It declined significantly in the era of desegregation, kind of came to kind of a settlement or a standstill since about the late 80s, and then has remained at around these levels since then. If you look geographically at the share of black kids attending majority non-white schools, so these are majority minority schools, here are their highest concentrations. Kind of interesting, the map of the United States is divided almost in half, north to south. Hispanic students, also a very significant number today, and you see their geographic distribution here. In terms of language needs, this goes beyond, of course, Hispanic students. Students of all kinds have language needs. So English language learners are also distributed in this kind of fashion throughout the United States. Low-income kids. Red is more low income, green is higher income. And then here's just a count in terms of special ed. We have about 6 million special ed kids in the United States. So how about school spending? So among the more advanced countries in the world, the United States is very high on school spending. We devote a significant share of GDP and also in terms of controlled dollars to our schools, right up there with Switzerland and Norway. But some people bemoan this fact because we don't really have the performance of Switzerland and Norway. And even as school spending per pupil has increased over time, here's the nominal figure and the red is the real figure. Some people would argue that student achievement has not kept pace with how much we are spending, and that's been a criticism. Here's sort of high and low spending jurisdictions. The darker the green, the more high spending. The lighter the green, the less high spending, lower spending. Okay, see the concentrations. What about school choice? So we have very significant growth in charter school enrollment, which Nina, of course, will speak to in the last decade and a half. Now it's almost approaching 3 million. Private school enrollment. Private school enrollment has held steady at about 10% of overall school kids for quite some number of years. This has not been a big change over time. That gives you a sense of the magnitude. And then here's a map of different kinds of jurisdictions that allow charter schools and then allow vouchers. You can see that the lighter the color are the ones that support charters, slightly darker are vouchers, and then the darkest are ones that are most, you might say, pro-choice. They support both charters and vouchers. So here's some lingo. Under the Federal Elementary and Secondary Act, there are a variety of federal requirements that school districts and states have to meet. John can tell us more about that. But they have to submit certain kinds of accountability plans and state plans to the federal government for approval, and this is the current state of play with respect to those plans. Okay, so the last slide was getting at part of where we are in education policy today, which is a bit of devolution and a loosening of federal control back down to states. But before we get to those topics, let me just turn to our panelists first with some just basic orienting questions. And the first would just be, what are a couple things that you can sort of take away from the trend lines that the education system is actually doing well? And what are a couple things that, in your mind, are the biggest priorities for things we need to keep our eye on? So, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for having me, even though Sunday afternoon is not the best time to do this, certainly after the panel beforehand, but I'm glad to see so many people in this room, and hopefully we can have a good discussion. So I would say the two things, and I am kind of in a bubble within a bubble in DC, so I'd love to hear what others have to say about this topic, but I think, in terms of the things that we're getting right, the fact that we have annual testing now, and that ESSA did, even though it's devolved quite a bit of power and control to states and localities, hasn't gotten rid of the notion of testing students every year in math and reading, disaggregating those results. I think having this kind of information is extremely helpful in whatever decision you want to make about what to do in your school to raise student achievement. So the focus on data and closing the achievement gap, quite frankly, is something that has stuck with us since Goals 2000. And even though ESSA has shifted a lot back to states, it's still something that we're going to continue focusing on. I would also say the research on teacher quality is pretty definitive, and those who are in the space will attest that the key factor in making sure that a student is doing well is going to be the quality of the teacher in that classroom. I don't think there's a lot of debate about that. I think the debate is really around where do we find these teachers, how do we compensate them, how do we keep them so that they can make the greatest difference in a child's life. In terms of the things that we're missing, there's so many things, but if I were to name two things, I would say one of them is just this, we're a little distracted by different things that are coming at us in the education space. I was part of the team that enacted No Child Left Behind, and I was very proud of the work that we did in those first few years because it really did focus our attention on the achievement gap and, quite frankly, back then on the importance of teaching kids how to read using scientifically researched methods of reading. And now I think there's just a lot of other discussion around different ways of making sure that we're building grit and resilience and other things which are very important, but there is no real science and way of teaching teachers how to do this in a way that actually gets you to where you want to go. I feel like they're still being kind of beta tested in the classroom. And so I would hope that in the shift in attention back to states and localities that we don't lose sight of the fact that if a child doesn't know how to read and do math, they're not going to be able to do a lot of other things very well. And if we were to focus the attention of educators on at least those two basic things, you will be able to get a lot of other things done better, faster down the road.
Thank you. Ted?
I totally agree with Nina that the testing and I guess I'd even go more broadly, the ability to evaluate teachers and students and determine how they're functioning. I think that there's been huge improvements over the last 20 or 30 years. The Gates Foundation, other professors have looked at this question of how can we tell how students are performing and how are teachers performing. And I think, as Nina points out, the data and it shows that teacher effectiveness is just absolutely crucial. And there's really no disagreement on that. And I think what has been a big improvement over the years is this access to data. So Professor Chetty at Harvard has shown that you can get these huge data masses and crunch the numbers and track the effects on a child of having an effective teacher or a grossly ineffective teacher. I also would say that the availability of innovative methods, charter schools, magnet schools, I think that is a great thing and shows a pathway to improve our school system. In terms of problems, and as a litigator and more of a generalist who comes in, not the experts that these three are on education policy and practices, but in terms of the problems, the economic segregation that you see. I'm from Los Angeles in California. It is, the best word for it is it's obscene. That you know that poor kids, minority kids are getting into schools that are in drastically worse shape than kids who go to other schools. And that the data in the Vergara case that Justice Liu mentioned, we had pretty much uncontested evidence that the effect on these children of having a grossly ineffective teacher, which we argued was due to the laws of California, was devastating to their income as adults. I think it was $1.4 million of lost income if a child had a teacher who was in the bottom 5% of the performance range. Teenage pregnancy, going to college, which college? I mean, and a lot of this came from Professor Chetty. The other thing is, I think what Justice Liu mentioned at the outset, I do think the gun violence. We have students in schools in K, through 12 who are getting gunned down en masse in their classroom. And so we have, if we didn't have enough problems in terms of funding, in terms of teacher compensation, all these other things, we have students who are feeling insecure in their classroom. And one of the students in Santa Fe said she had sort of expected that this sort of tragedy would happen at her school. So we've got some major, major problems to deal with.
John?
Thanks. First, grateful to be here and grateful to do this panel with such thoughtful co-panelists. I guess I'd pick up where Ted left off. I think, to me, the biggest challenge we have is that today, if you look at the nation's schools, the majority of our kids are kids of color in the nation's public schools. The majority of kids in the nation's public schools are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. If we continue to fail to educate low-income students and students of color, we have no future as a country. Our economy has no future. Our democracy has no future. So the stakes on the challenges are very, very high. Now, the hopeful thing we can say is there are places that are doing it better. You can go to any community around the country and find schools, district or charter, that are getting exceptional outcomes serving low-income students, students of color. But we aren't very good at scaling those things. And we have very large systemic obstacles that, as Ted described, result in the kids who need the most getting the least. So the kids who need the most have less access to quality pre-K. They have less access to effective teachers. They have less access to a well-rounded education that includes things like science and social studies and the arts. They have less access to school counselors. Thinking about this issue of gun violence, consider that in the Civil Rights Data Collection Survey that the Education Department does, we show there are 1.6 million kids who go to a school where there is a sworn law enforcement officer and no school counselor. And what does that suggest about how we think about our young people? So we give kids who need the most the least, and we concentrate the kids who need the most in a subset of schools. So despite the fact that we are more than 60 years past Brown, we have communities where the schools are more segregated by race and class today than they were 10 or 20 years ago. And then we systematically under-resource those very same schools. So the final point I make is, there are these hopeful signs. There are places where you can see excellence. But on the whole, we have a system that is designed to get the result we get. In fact, it's perfectly designed to get the result we get, which is systematic underserving of low-income students, students of color, English learners.
Could I pick up on the point about teachers then? So each of you mentioned there was some nods around the panel about the data, the studies about teacher effectiveness and how that's the crucial input. And I think nobody would disagree with that. But the devil, of course, is in the details. And where people do disagree is in how you identify who are the effective teachers and at what point in teachers' careers you'd make that identification, right? So I wonder, Ted, I could call on you because you were involved in this, and others too, please chime in. How do we engineer a better system?
It's a really important point, and maybe I'll just tether it a bit to our Vergara case, because we brought this case challenging California laws, three laws. One was the teacher tenure law, which allowed for tenure decisions within 2 years, but really was more like 12 months to 16 months, oftentimes before the teacher had even gone through the certification process and really the teacher training, and they call it permanent employment. And then there was a series of dismissal statutes, which makes it virtually impossible to dismiss even the worst teacher. It was the data showed, and this is really uncontested. We had a trial, we won at trial. The data showed it could take 2 to 10 years to dismiss a teacher who was clearly not performing, who was engaging in misconduct. It could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was virtually impossible to dismiss them, even if you did evaluate them. And then third, in California, seniority is the only factor that's looked at to lay off teachers. So last in, first out was how it was decided. And so therefore, and the unions have argued, when we argued, well, there should be some performance evaluation. And if one of our witnesses was the teacher of the year, and she was laid off because she was more junior than, let's say, the worst teacher in the system. And everybody agreed, the unions, the state of California, that there were thousands of grossly ineffective teachers in the system. The unions argued, and I never could quite understand this, that if you evaluated based on performance when you laid off teachers, that would stop teachers from collaborating as a team, because I wouldn't want to help you because you might do better, and then when it came to layoff time, I might be laid off. Imagine if any organization functioned that way. And this is the only system I've ever heard of that. And so we argued, and the data I think is very strong, that there are ways to judge teacher effectiveness. And one of the things I find amazing is like Obama administration, Bush administration, there's a lot of agreement on a lot of these issues. The research shows that through looking at student performance and measuring that through the years and with teachers, looking at student evaluations of their teachers, looking at classroom observation. It's not rocket science. And so I think there is a systematic way, and there's an argument that there's too much testing and that teachers are under too much pressure. I understand that. We can deal with that. But the all or nothing, that for some reason of all the organizations in the world, teachers should not be judged on their performance, makes absolutely no sense. We need to make it fair, have a legitimate, rational way of judging how teachers perform, because the bottom line is we want students to learn, and they need to have great teachers to do that.
Nina, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what we've learned about teachers and from the charter school space, and you might want to begin with just for our audience telling them a little bit about how charters work,
Yes.
the basic bargain involved in what a charter school is. I know there's a lot of diversity of charters, but what is the basic model there?
Right, so charters are public schools. We've now had charter school laws for a little over 26 years. The first charter school law passed in Minnesota. Every state has a different law. And so it's a little unfair to compare these charter schools to one another because they come with a degree of autonomy in some states that are not in existence in other places. We have a little over 7,000 public charter schools serving 3.2 million students every day. I would say the key difference between a charter school and a public school is that there is a contract that governs the charter school, which if the charter doesn't adhere to the terms of the contract, the authorizer of that school can in fact close the school. They're also held accountable by the families who attend them. If they cannot attract enough families, they're not going to be able to keep their doors open. So in that respect, they are fully accountable to the public and to the parents who they serve. The key difference, I would say, in many states that have the ability to create charter schools is that they can hire highly qualified teachers and give them differentiated pay. They can also adjust their school day and school day to meet the needs of the students in the school. And so that autonomy allows you to do a lot of things that the traditional system, unfortunately, can't do quickly. So in that respect, we're able to test a lot of ideas and see what works and what doesn't. A lot of the leaders of our charter schools were people who were former teachers in the traditional system who wanted to come up with a new way of teaching and that created charter schools in order to test their ideas in these systems. And some of our best charter schools, like Success Academy in New York, spend an inordinate amount of time training their teachers before they put them in the classroom. So when people talk about success and the secret to success, it truly is in that system about teacher training. Eva Moskowitz spends an inordinate amount of time on pre-service and in-service training of her teachers. And I think as a nation, again, that is the area, and we're not going to talk too much about higher education, but I think that's the investment that we haven't made consistently. A lot of our teacher education colleges and universities are not really teaching our teachers the way that other countries are training their teacher workforce. And so once they're in the classroom, I was at a school recently who the principal was telling me they had an English teacher who all of a sudden was told he has to teach math, and here's a textbook. So to me, you kind of want to have individuals in these settings who actually have subject matter mastery and not be beholden to just someone who's really capable and able to quickly grasp the concept in order to convey it then to the students.
So here's the question, bring John in too, same question for Nina and John, which is, you mentioned there are places that are doing it well, with low-income kids, with minority kids, but the problem is scaling. What are we learning from those places about teachers, the primary input, which you all agree, that can be translated into some sort of policy instead of just being a one-off success?
Yeah. Well, Nina points to the example of the success charters. I would argue the most successful charter networks have in common this intense focus on teacher quality, rigorous selection of teachers, investing in teacher preparation and professional development, giving teachers regular feedback to continue to improve their performance. In many ways, their practices look more like some of those international competitors that you put up. If you think about Singapore, why is Singapore at the top of the PISA charts? Well, partly it's because Singapore is selective about becoming a teacher. They pay for your teacher training. They have a very elaborate career ladder model with rigorous evaluations where teachers can move up and get leadership roles if they demonstrate effectiveness in the classroom. And if you go to Singapore, business leaders, military leaders, political leaders, everybody will say, most important profession in our society, teachers, because that profession is one that makes all other careers possible. Right? There is that universal understanding of the importance of the teaching profession. We unfortunately don't see that at the system level. I do think if you look at schools that are succeeding, you're going to find strong principals and strong teachers. 80 to 90% of what we spend in schools is on people. So we could scale some of these things, but as Ted has described, the politics are quite challenging.
Let me move then to some of the politics. It was mentioned testing has been one of the successes in a way of the last era, just in terms of the transparency it's given us into the system, and many of the things that we know now about achievement gaps and opportunity gaps stem from that. No Child Left Behind, of course, was passed during the Bush presidency, with tremendous collaboration with Senator Ted Kennedy. They were sort of jokingly kind of an odd couple in Washington, D.C., and in fact, they kind of outflanked in the middle the more extreme elements of both of their parties who resisted these innovations. Where is the center today on education policy? Is there a center today? Is there anything that people politically could work together on?
I mean, I'll, as the sort of non-politician in the group, sort of, say where I think, because I see a lot in California, Democrats who are very supportive of all the things that I was just saying we need. So testing, let's focus on quality, let's compensate teachers, let's revere teachers, but let's do it in the way we would in a business or in an organization where we're trying to have the greatest team. If we're spending 90% of our money on people, we want to make sure we have the best people we can get and for the students. And so we have Eli Broad and the Broad Foundation in Los Angeles, big Democratic contributor, institution in our city, Democrat. We have Austin Butner, who's now the new superintendent of schools, Democrat, and focusing on those sorts of issues. The Obama administration was willing to take steps to buck the, and again, footnote, I'm not a teachers union or union basher. I think unions can serve an important purpose, but was willing to say, unions are great, but we have to have some balance here. And so, so I think the politics generally, there's a lot more Republican and Democrat agreement on a lot of these issues, but the teachers unions, to their credit, they represent teachers, so they have a pretty singular focus, and they're in the mode of all or nothing. If we give up a little, it could all go. And ironically, it's a little bit like the gun debate, that if we have a little bit of gun reform, gun enthusiasts and advocates think and are told that we're going to take away your guns. And with the unions, I think there's a feel that if we give up a little on tenure or on pensions or on anything, you're going to take it all away from us, and so we can't budge at all. And to me, that's the political roadblock, and I think it's really harmful for students.
John, during the Obama administration, the administration took a set of tough positions against unions oftentimes. How did that go, and how did that change the character of the political issue?
Well, so two observations. One is, I think you're going to get the most traction on increased accountability when it comes with a reasonable investment of resources. So if you're in a state like Oklahoma, where teachers make $20,000 less than they would make if they went over the border to Texas, that is a very difficult context in which to say to teachers, we want to ask more. Because people feel like, well, when am I going to do that? I have my extra 2 jobs that I do just to be able to pay my mortgage and feed my kids. So part of what I think we need to do to hold the center is be willing to put adequate resources in alongside accountability. And when you create that bargain, I think you get much more traction. The second thing is, folks who support education reform have to be willing to acknowledge the things that aren't working. So I'm a supporter of public charters. I was a principal of a high-performing public charter in Massachusetts. There are states like Massachusetts and New York that have very strong systems of high-performing charters, but we have to acknowledge there are also states that have terrible charter authorizing and have a proliferation of chronically low-performing for-profit schools. We have folks here from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has these virtual charters that just are an embarrassment. And so if you're not willing to hold those schools accountable, when you say charters are about greater accountability, you sound insincere. And so I think we have to hold everybody accountable, including folks who support ed reform, to actually stand up for the best interests of kids, always.
So Nina, not only teachers, but also the deregulation space, where is the common ground? Because we have moved, I think, in terms of regulation.
Well, we have, but your question was around where is the center, and the center of both parties, certainly at the federal level, is thinning quite a bit. When I was doing this work in the late 90s, early 2000s, you had blue dog Democrats. I don't know if they're even called that anymore. But we still have a lot of support, certainly at the federal level, for charter schools. We just celebrated Charter Schools Week. We usually get a resolution going, and we got a good critical mass of Democrats and Republicans supporting charter schools. And at the state level also, I know that the conflicts tend to get a lot of attention, but in most places where we've been able to actually pass something, we've had the support of Democrats and Republicans across the board. I would say the shift in federal power back to states that ESSA was brought because Republicans and Democrats on the far right and the far left came together to support that devolution. I would say at the state level, the one area that has actually brought a lot of people on the Republican side together with Democrats is early childhood education and access to high quality childcare and pre-K programs. Now, how much momentum has that gained? Is there enough money behind it? Remains to be seen, but I do think that area is one area that I've seen a lot of movement in bringing both parties together. It could also be because that space is not unionized, and the unions are interested in unionizing it, so everyone's paying a lot of attention to that, and the research is really definitive in that if you get those first 3 to 5 years right, you'll be able to get a lot more done down the road. So I'm pretty optimistic. I think the media tends to focus on all the chaos and the noise, when in reality, I think we have more in common than meets the eye right now.
That's a hopeful comment. Thank you. So I want to get to audience questions. So start thinking about your questions. But I want to put one more question on the table that's of particular, I think, interest to this group, which is the role of law and courts in this. So John, you mentioned Brown, of course, and then since Brown, we've had not only the nation's experience with school desegregation, we've also had a very large experience with school funding. Lawsuits, which traveled from, let's say, the late 60s all the way even into the present day, although they are sort of fewer and farther in between now. What do you think? What are our lessons learned, I guess, from the experience of? And in fact, Nina, you mentioned just now the early childhood. I'm reminded that. One of my academic colleagues, James Ryan, who became the dean of the Harvard Education School, wrote an article called "A Constitutional Right to Preschool." Right. So there's still this kind of desire to recognize what isn't actually recognized in federal constitutional law, which is some sort of right to some quality education or quality experience in these early years. What are we to conclude from these experiences? I'll start with you.
Well, I'd start with Supreme Court justices matter a lot. Is the first thing. So I would argue that Brown produced a lot of positive results throughout our society, but including, if you look back at those NAEP charts, a real closing of achievement gaps, particularly for African American students, as Brown was implemented, really through the 80s. Then, when you had the consequences of the, I would argue, wrongly decided Milliken case, which said suburbs essentially wouldn't be included in the resolution of school desegregation cases because you couldn't show that those suburbs were created expressly for, those suburban districts were created expressly for the purpose of segregation. What you had then was the stalling of school desegregation in the 80s, and since then, not nearly as much progress on closing of racial achievement gaps. And so, if the Brown court had been the court at the time of Milliken, I think the outcome would have been different. So that's one thing, you have to be willing to pay close attention to who gets on, as you know, and live every day. You have to be willing to pay attention to who gets on to courts, because that's where these issues are going to be resolved. The second on school finance is there have been a lot of school finance victories in state courts based on state constitutions, but then the challenge is getting the legislature to actually put the money in and stay with it through economic downturns. And that is about political will. And I think, for me, one lesson is that legal victories without building political will are insufficient to meet the challenge. You've got to have a strategy for how you're going to sustain a political consensus.
Nina?
You know, my first job was actually working at a public interest law firm for an attorney who loved to file class action suits on behalf of low-income families who wanted to send their children to better public or private schools. So I have long thought that you'd be better served if there was some sort of private right of action for those students to access a high-quality school. I am told that it's very difficult to do that at the federal level, and that potentially the only way to overturn this is if the Rodriguez case was being relitigated. But we have a legal action fund at the National Alliance. We have roughly 20 cases right now that we're monitoring at the state level. And it's very interesting just because chartering has so many issues actually on the legal side that when we were passing legislation were not fully answered or resolved. So it would be nice if we could take one of the victories in one place and actually replicate it somewhere else. But right now, unfortunately, we're fighting for each case one state at a time. So.
Reversing Rodriguez?
Yeah, yes, exactly. In fact, we're working on exactly that point because it's very interesting. So I mentioned the Vergara case in California. I mentioned the happy part of it. We won a trial. The trial judge found that it was the system shocked the conscience, what was happening to students, that was unfathomable. The Court of Appeal in California reversed, and then the California Supreme Court denied review 4-3 with a powerful dissent from Justice Liu and from Justice Cuellar and another justice dissenting as well. And the next day, we were knocked down, we got up off the mat and we were ready, we filed a federal action in Connecticut arguing for a federal fundamental right to education equality in education quality, a minimum level of quality education in Connecticut. And in Connecticut, just very briefly to give you the context, it's absolutely clear that most of the public schools, particularly in the urban areas, are failing and kids are suffering. But the charter schools and magnet schools there, the record is superb and dramatically different, and those are public schools. But the state has passed a law that puts a moratorium that really restricts the numbers, that keeps kids out of them. There's a lottery for school districts that can bring kids in from other districts, but if they do it, they're punished economically for doing that. So it's a nonsensical system where the state is knowingly keeping kids in terrible schools when there are other alternatives. So we've argued that the San Antonio versus Rodriguez case, which was a funding case, so the Supreme Court said there's no fundamental right to a level of funding. And one of the reasons they said that was it was too hard to tell, it's hard to tell what was needed, and the courts would be in this business of judging the levels of funding and quality. But we argue that number one, the court in San Antonio didn't rule out the possibility of a fundamental constitutional right that would be subjected to strict scrutiny when it was burdened in other contexts outside of funding. And this was many years ago, decades ago. The Papasan decision from the Supreme Court later noted that this was an open issue, whether there was a fundamental right to education. The Supreme Court in Washington versus Glucksberg set a new standard that says you look to see is the right something that's deeply rooted in our traditions and in the concept of ordered liberty, and whether you could come up with a rule that was somewhat controllable. And then we have other due process and equal protection type cases, including the Supreme Court's decision in Obergefell on marriage equality. And if you read that decision and just take marriage out and put the word education in many of the passages, it's hard to come away with the notion that there isn't a fundamental right to education in our country. It's deeply rooted in our history. The Continental Congress gave land to the states to make sure there was a public system of education. The framers said education was crucial to our democracy, so citizens can learn and read and understand the system and make reasoned decisions. The Supreme Court has said it over and over again. Obergefell, I think, says education is one of those fundamental rights, like the right to marry and other rights. And if you look at Brown, just the 64th anniversary, the words that the court used in Brown, that it's essential that everybody has a right to an equality of education. It's essential to someone's ability to participate in society. Our California Supreme Court decision, Serrano, which found a right under the state constitutional to funding, said education's the lifeblood. It's what brings people from the lowest place in society to the top. And it's, again, kind of a principle you can't really disagree with. So we think we've got a strong argument. There's a motion to dismiss pending against us. It's been pending for a year. We hope the judge is writing an eloquent, powerful decision finding this right.
Could I ask one follow-up just for any of you, actually, from the perspective of a skeptical judge, which I may or may not be.
I have seen you in that mode, I will attest.
But I think in a sense, no one would disagree with any of these propositions. I mean, they are so basic as to be not, but I think the pushback comes from two kinds of lines, and they're both present in Rodriguez, right? One is just federalism, which is to say, what Nina says about you're having to litigate in every single state, and you can't take solutions from one to the other. Some people would say, well, that's good because we have diversity in America, and we don't want one size fits all, and you really ought to be careful what you wish for, because that is actually the lesson of Rodriguez, which is that if you go to the U.S. Supreme Court, you may not get what you want, and then you have this precedent on the books. Okay, so that's one argument. The other argument is just institutional competence. Why should courts be involved in this area? Because that's more of a horizontal point, right? This is, you guys are policy wonks of the highest order. I include you, Ted, even among that label. And judges, workaday judges who are the ultimate generalists, kind of look at this and say, what do I really know about the one best system? I'm just a workaday judge. Give me a statute, I'll interpret it, but I can't make these kind of judgments. So, where do those points sort of fit into?
Those really are the two key points. I think on the second one, whether judicial competence, that was a big issue in Rodriguez, and I think. This goes back to where I started. The data, the ability to make judgments based on the data and studies and tests, and we had this whole trial, and it was really undisputed that, look, we show there are these problems. So I think that change since Rodriguez allows courts to it's an area of competence for the courts. We're not asking for micromanagement in our Connecticut, because we're not asking for a remedy like desegregation. We're saying if the system is so bad and you demonstrate that it falls. So the Connecticut Supreme Court said the right is basically to lights, pencils, and heat. That's we're saying courts can maybe take it up a notch, and make a judgment at a different level. And so I think it's within the courts there'd be plenty of room for the legislatures, for the states, to legislate. But if the court, this is what courts do. There's always an intrusion in the marriage equality and all sorts of other areas where the courts say this violates a fundamental right. Leaves the states here would leave wide array for experimentation, for federalism, and so I think on that front it's completely consistent with the way the courts operate, and it wouldn't intrude on federalism, and it's something the courts could manage.
The thing I'd add to that, to me, it's sort of grounded. What do you think the Reconstruction Amendments were for, right? And if you think about the 14th Amendment as intended to prevent a caste system in the United States, there's no surer way to achieve a caste system than to systematically deny folks access to education. They can't participate in democracy. They can't sort of insist on any of their rights if they can't read, if they don't have the ability to engage. And to me, that's what this Connecticut case. There's a case in Michigan around the right to literacy. To me, that's the theory of it, right? That we are very clear in our Constitution that we don't want a caste system, and in order to guarantee that, we have to make sure that people get a foundational education.
Last word? Okay, let me get some audience questions. We'll bring in some more voices. Go ahead. Yes, in the back.
So
Tell us where you're from, too.
No
worries.
So I'm Anna Shavers from the University of Nebraska.
Thank you.
So in terms of pushing for the fundamental right to education, but also taking with that the idea that we want to maintain some state control, I'm wondering if some of you would react to the idea that the next step is perhaps not just to have a recognition of a fundamental right under the federal Constitution, but also federal funding of education that might be handled by states in some way. But what do you think about the idea of moving to more federal assistance? ESSA, of course, seems to be going the route of less federal involvement, but I'd like some reaction to that.
John?
Well, look, my instinct is I would love to see more federal funding targeted in the way that ESEA was originally intended, right? When Lyndon Johnson, who was a teacher, signed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, he talked about it as a law that was intended to address the gaps in opportunity for low-income students, right? And to address the lack of access to opportunity that he had witnessed firsthand as a teacher in Texas, right? So should we double, triple, quadruple Title I? Sure, I'd be for that. I think you're right, the current politics do not take us in that direction. But this is also a problem at the state level relative to local communities. In most states, the heavy reliance on local property taxes exacerbates inequality. And one of the best ways to address that inequality would be to shift the burden more to the state and away from the local level. And you have states, whether it's New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, before their recent school finance reform, where you have this tremendous burden on tax burden on local districts, and because they don't have the real estate wealth, they can tax themselves at an extraordinary rate. They still won't be able to close the gaps with affluent suburban communities.
Nina, would more federal funding be better?
I have to disagree a little bit, just because when you look at the overall arc of federal investment, you haven't necessarily seen improvements across the board on student achievement. I think the federal funding is important when you're negotiating something from a political standpoint to get something in return. But until there's a fundamental change in the way we do things at the state and local level, I feel that the money is just going to be wasted on a lot of things that may work in some places but not work across the board. And so a lot of it is going to be around teacher pay, how you pay them, and how you're able to give the great teachers more money and not so much to the others. Until you fix that, it's going to be difficult to just say funding alone will be able to make a difference.
I'm told that we need to move to the mics for the recording. So if you have a question, please move to the mics. Go ahead.
Jim George, Austin, Texas. I am from a state in which we have a very diverse availability of resources. I grew up in a little town in Brady, Texas, a high school class of 55. Our capacity of that high school to fund education was dependent upon property taxes and rural Texas. Much of Texas is rural. If you live in a school district and that has a lot of oil and gas production, you're not so poor. But if you don't live in those kind of places, you have a much less capacity to fund your educational burden. It creates this kind of local burden to fund education, creates disparity within the same state, Texas being an extreme example. Rio Grande Valley school districts are terribly underfunded. The ones in Highland Park in Dallas are well-funded. One like Brady, Texas is semi-well-funded, but it is serendipity of where the child and the parents live. That's the fundamental flaw, I think, in almost every jurisdiction that I've studied in this part, that they don't take the whole jurisdiction and come up with a funding formula that makes a difference. I happen to be on the Austin KIPP schools. I was beginning that. That system produced the virtually 90% of our children, many of whose parents were illegal, came to our school because their kids could get an education beyond what they could get in the public schools. But to fund that kind of education require me to go beg money from a lot of people to give us the resources to do that. If Brady, Texas, or El Dorado, Texas, had the same kind of funding that I generated for the KIPP school kids in Austin, we now have several campuses, it would change the world. And this whole discussion is based upon is this inequality of resources based upon where you live.
Let me interject. I do have one thought on that, as do some of the panelists, I'm sure. Thank you. Do you have a more specific question?
No, I just was having that.
I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to harvest a few questions, and then we can keep these in mind, and we can react to several of them at once. So go ahead, microphone 2.
David Aronofsky, also from Austin, Texas, and had I stayed in the school in the town I grew up with, my graduating class would have been half the size of my good friend from Austin and Brady, but that's not my question. I've heard very little mentioned about curriculum. As a longtime public school educator and a licensed secondary teacher, I'm a nut on standardizing really high quality curriculum. Your point about magnet schools, I think, is a good one. But why are they successful? Because their curriculum happens to be what I think should be the standard in all of the schools, and I'd like to get your thoughts about that. The second question I have is probably addressed to you, because you've studied Singapore more closely. What is the disparity in pay between the teacher with, say, 5 years experience in Singapore and the superintendent of the school district? Because in Oklahoma, a state you mentioned, it's about 12 times. And I consider that to be an abomination. So thank you.
Okay, one more. Microphone 3.
Yeah, hi, Anuj Desai from Madison, Wisconsin. I must admit I don't know all that much about the public school system, but one thing we have in Wisconsin, and I think you saw on the map there, is also vouchers. And I haven't heard anything about that. And that, of course, in the federal system, at least right now with the current administration, is actually quite a big deal. So I'd just love to hear some reactions about people's thoughts about vouchers.
Okay, let's do a round of quick reactions to these questions. Let me just say in response to the gentleman about local funding disparities, you know, I come from a state that actually has a different problem. We don't have local funding disparities of the same kind. In California, we suffered actually from overregulation from the center, which created a very opaque system of school funding whereby there were formulas that very few people in Sacramento could understand. And one of the innovations that Jerry Brown managed in his tenure is to replace that system with essentially a weighted student formula system, which is very popular in some jurisdictions. So I think that issue, it has been addressed in some jurisdictions, not all, of course, because we have a very diverse country. And it should also be pointed out that it's not always the case, and this is a controversial point, but it's not always the case that the school districts with the neediest kids are getting the least amount of money. If you look at New Jersey, for example, one of the great successes of the Abbott litigation is that those urban districts in New Jersey today get a heck of a lot more money than they used to, and indeed in some places more than the statewide averages. We can still debate whether that's enough money given the needs, right? But we shouldn't just blithely, assert that all those schools are getting less money than others, because I think that's probably not true. So. Other reactions on curriculum was a point about disparity in pay between the administrators and the teachers, and also about vouchers. So why don't we just go down the line? John, want to start?
Sure. So I don't know how much this equivalent of the superintendent role makes in Singapore relative to teachers, but I will say Singapore has been very intentional about trying to keep the sort of disparity between other college-educated workers and teachers smaller to make teaching a more competitive field. They also pay for teacher preparation, which then removes a burden that a lot of our teachers in the United States have, worrying how will they pay back their school loans if they choose teaching. On the voucher issue, for me, I think the evidence on vouchers on the whole around the country is pretty negative in terms of student outcomes. I worry a lot about the sort of undermining of public institutions that you see. I'm really nervous about places like Indiana, where the voucher program is really a scheme to move resources from public education into subsidizing middle and affluent families that are paying for private school, kids who were never in public school in the first place, who are taking advantage of their voucher program. So to me, that is just an unacceptable direction. But I realize the politics, particularly in some states, are pushing towards ever larger investments in voucher programs. The last point on curriculum, I'm a huge fan of investments in quality curriculum, and I think the evidence is actually quite strong that when you have a quality curriculum, it can produce significant gains in achievement. There are some states doing interesting things. Louisiana is subsidizing school districts' purchase of curriculum materials if those curriculum materials have been identified as leading to better student outcomes and evidence-based. So there's some promising work around open educational resources, people making available high-quality curriculum for free online. That, I think, is encouraging. But you're right, there has not been enough attention, I think, in the general education policy discourse around curriculum.
And I was going to say, it seems like a great way to save money if you have a really strong standardized curriculum that you can be free and hand out. And going back to Jim George's point, I do think in California that our state court, California Supreme Court years ago struck down that sort of inequitable funding. And now, if you think about it, that was basically San Antonio versus Rodriguez. It's not that hard to say Brady is getting, very little money, the schools are bad, and then we analyze it with new data techniques and expert techniques. These other places are getting way more. That's inequitable. That violates the Constitution. So I think taking another run at that issue is worthwhile.
So very quickly, on vouchers, I would say how these programs are constructed matters, and there is a degree of there's a difference between the Wisconsin program and the one in DC, for instance, which was enacted back when President Bush was in office. In terms of the Secretary's agenda on vouchers, it hasn't really gotten very far, so I can't really comment on whether she will actually have the votes of the Republicans in her party to pass anything. But on terms of, we can talk a little bit more because of my background. Actually, before this job, I did quite a bit on this issue. And one of the reasons I believe in charter schools is because it's one of the only ways to create new schools in a community if you want to offer families choices. Whenever choice programs through vouchers have been expanded, I've noticed there hasn't been a lot of innovation coming out of the private sector, and I certainly haven't seen a lot of private schools taken to scale in order to meet the demand. So in most cases, and it could be just because of the way these laws are written, it's become just a lifeline for the local Catholic school that was ready, willing, and able to take the kids, which is ultimately not going to enhance the robust menu of options you want to have in these communities. I agree with John's point about curriculum. I think that's one of those areas that doesn't get a lot of attention. It's not very sexy, but at the end of the day, that is the area we should focus a lot more attention on if we want to make a difference in the classroom, what's in the curriculum, how teachers are teaching that curriculum, whether the test is aligned to the curriculum is ultimately what's going to make the greatest difference. And I agree with you about your points about funding. One of the things about charter schools we like to highlight, we don't like to say this, but we only get about 70 cents of every dollar that follows students to traditional schools. In the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, which was mentioned earlier, IDEA Public Charter Schools, again, gets a lot less in terms of funding, but produces outstanding outcomes. So we've been able to do more with less, so to speak, but that doesn't mean that it's a fair system, because ultimately the districts are always going to have competitive advantages, and you're not necessarily going to be able to have a sustainable model when that is the way the system is constructed.
I know we're running short on time. If I could prevail on the panelists for just five minutes and hear 3 more questions. If you could please be short, 30 seconds, because I want to be sensitive to the agenda as well. Let's hear the questions and we'll have some closing comments.
I'll be short, but there are 3 points I want to make. One is everybody wants their own children to get the best education possible. And so there tends to be a bias in the way people approach it. That means that parents get very much involved in what education is and how it's going to be operated. People who have no children in school anymore or ever have much less interest in putting money into education. That's a problem. But I want to go back to one thing that when you first talked about children being afraid to go to school, and I was very interested to note the conversation, of course, goes to the students who were shot in Texas, which was a terrible event, but one, maybe 2 days before that, a student was shot in Dixon, Illinois at school, and the day after that, a student was shot in Georgia at school. And nobody seems to pay any attention to the, well, there's certainly just one, but I don't think that's any less significant. The fact is, this seems to be going on and becoming very popular as a copycat event. The other point that I wanted to make is that I wish this whole thing were an easy problem to solve. But in the 70s, when we had the decision on segregated schools and integrating schools and the requirement that schools be integrated, there was a tremendous accomplishment in integrating schools. And sadly, and I'm old enough to have watched this, when you got to the 80s and 90s, it all disappeared. Nobody cared anymore. The law is still there, but nobody was doing anything about it because people didn't really worry about that. And finally, when you talk about magnet schools, I'm from Chicago, I grew up in Rhode Island, I've seen boarding schools across New England, I've seen charter schools in various places, and there are all kinds of different rules that affect them. But the fact is the schools are not equal, they're not run on an equal basis. You look in the Chicago area, and whatever funding is done by community schools in general. If you look at the North Shore, where the wealthier people in Chicago live generally, they put 10 to 20, 50% more money into those schools so that they will be sure that their children get a good education. Oddly enough, and I'm just going to add this, what happens in some of those top schools is that when some of the students don't perform very well because people are different, students are different, some have a harder time than others, the schools tend to ignore them. And they find that a lot of the students are not getting a good education, but the effort in the schools going into the better students.
Thank you. I didn't get to see the gentleman at mic 1, but let me take this one, and I'll include you as well, and we'll take all these questions. Go ahead, too.
Hi, Evelyn Keyes. I'm from Houston, Texas. So we've pretty well covered Texas from the smallest to the largest. We've got Santa Fe in my own judicial district. So there we are. Okay, but I don't want to talk about that. What I do want to talk about is something that came through as you all got to the end of your presentation, which was, I know we'll solve the problem, we'll take everything to the courts, we're going to move these political questions because they're hard to solve to the Supreme Court level where everything will become a constitutional question, and we can solve that problem once we've completely federalized everything under uniform laws that will be totally data-driven and money-driven, and we will decree for everyone complete equality and all the problems will be solved. That was the exact opposite of what I had heard from each of you before that, which was each of you is a serious expert on very serious problems in education, and they are multifarious. So how do you deal with the multifarious problems that need to be dealt with? I'm no genius in this, but I would like to pose a question when you all talk again. What about something like a presidential commission to bring together people who really do see the real, live, honest-to-God problems that are of so many different types in public education and in education in general? Get some input from the people who are doing a great job in private education. Get it however you can get it. And then make recommendations to our worthless Congress and try to get them on the stick to actually go out there and be shamed. That's my question, sort of.
Yes, sir. Microphone 1. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I recently heard a paper presentation from an African-American who's a junior in college about his education experience. He spent, I guess he went through junior high in public schools and then went to a private school for high school. And his paper was about how to improve the system. And there were two big ideas that I heard. One, he said he never had an African-American teacher until he was in college. And so he wanted to, that in public schools, and I don't know, but he was saying in terms of the teachers, that was a big thing for him. The second thing was in terms of that qualified teacher, it was qualified and caring. And that was the big difference between when he went to the private school was that the teachers cared about his learning. When he was in public school, he did have a little reference about the standardized testing. His sense was that the teachers, in terms of teaching and trying to prepare the test, it was about a paycheck, it was about pleasing politicians, not about making sure that the students learn. And so that's, I'm not sure this is a question, but it's how do you, from their side, get these qualified and caring teachers? And I'm not sure how the testing fits into it, but that was his perception. It wasn't about his learning.
Thank you, Professor.
Well, I'd like to actually play off of a couple of things both that you said and he said. My name is Rhonda Schneider, and I teach both education law and constitutional law in two separate courses, and sometimes they come together. But my question is a little bit Pollyannish, perhaps some would think, but I'm intrigued by how we can try to enhance the prestige or the importance of teachers in our society. I know Singapore, as you've suggested some of the things, Finland has also done some creative stuff with changing that. So I'm really intrigued with, other than the obvious pay them more and help forgive their loans, which maybe is the answer, but are there any other ways that we can do that so we get to the caring teacher for all of our kids? And the second thing is that I'm a little intrigued with is, while the testing outcomes help a lot, and I know all of you are in praise of the testing, I'm a little concerned that what we're raising are children that are really good at testing. And so from the teacher perspective, can we have our teachers do a lot of the experimentation in a positive way so that we can figure out ways of teaching critical thinking, creativity, and so on and so forth, other than just using our basic testing, which serves its purpose. I'm not knocking the testing, but I'm saying, isn't there more? And maybe that's part of my first question as well.
Okay, great. Okay, so we have a number of topics from school safety to over-judicialization to teacher diversity and testing issues. So in the context of any closing comments you'd like to make, perhaps you could address these. Let's just go down the list here.
There are so many different points made, I don't even know where to start. I mean, I would argue on the judicial overreach, I'm not an attorney, but I just think that at the end of the day, if you believe that a good education is going to be the great equalizer, it's a shame that those who stand to gain the most from a good education have no recourse unless they're special needs students in some places. So it's as basic as that, and I will leave it up to smarter attorneys and people in this room to figure out how to do this in a way that doesn't completely federalize this. We definitely don't want to have more centralized control. There's a lot of value in having a decentralized system, such as the one we have in this country. But if you want to be a global competitor with countries like Singapore and Hong Kong and other places, you do need to look at this a little bit differently than the way we've been looking at it. On some of the other issues, I didn't know what the questions were, I guess.
Well, there was a question about school safety.
Yes.
And then there was a question about teacher diversity.
Yes, so on teacher diversity, yes. I mean, that is definitely an issue. It's always better to be in a classroom with a teacher who comes from your community. And in many cases, in those communities, it means teachers of color. But all things being equal, in both our public charter and our education system as a whole, we haven't been able to really diversify the teaching field. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, our leaders of color are going to other fields and they're not attracted to teaching. And so in order to change that equation, I do think this ties to the last question that came up, which is about elevating the stature of teaching. It certainly is not just about pay scales and so forth. It is about the way this country views it's teaching workforce and how the messages that the workforce and parents sometimes send to their children as they're growing up about the types of fields that they should enter after they graduate. And so this is going to take some time. There are a couple of things out there. I used to work for the Milkins. They have a Teacher Educator Award. They give out $25,000 checks to the best teacher in 2 schools per state every year in a way to bring these teachers into a community and elevate the stature of teaching. There are a lot of programs out there, but I don't think we've actually gotten to the bottom of figuring out how to do this in a way that that actually sticks. And ultimately, you want to make sure that you're sending students to college in order to become teachers rather than, the fields that they're most likely to want to go into if they want to make money or if they want to be considered successful.
I'll address the federalizing point because I think it's something we're very sensitive to and agree that it's, we don't want the U.S. Supreme Court to decree every school must do X, Y, and Z. And the goal would be to have it be an issue, a case that gets to the Supreme Court where everyone would say that those students' rights, their rights to just the minimal basic education level are being violated. It's a fundamental right and they're not getting it. The states would have continue to have exactly the same wide range of authority to do what they're doing. I agree with you, and that's part of what we're talking about. And I think it goes back to also the nurturing, revering teachers. I think it's very important, and I think diversity is crucial. I went to public school in North Dakota, and my father talked about my first grade teacher until the day he died. He thought she had a big effect on me and our whole family. So I think it is crucial. I think we need to remake the system, to reorder our priorities, to recruit a diverse body of talented teachers, compensate them well, take care of them well, make sure they've got a great career path. And maybe that does take a commission, but we have to have a minimum level and view education as this fundamental right to everybody, every child in this country, and the rest should follow from that.
John.
Trying to end on a hopeful note. I think in the Every Student Succeeds Act, there are some opportunities to address some of the things that we've been talking about in important ways. One, I think that there was a bipartisan consensus that NCLB, by focusing on English and math scores and high school graduation rates as the kind of only indicators of accountability, had a narrowing effect in many places. And ESSA gives states the ability to include how are students doing in science and social studies, to include are students getting access to advanced coursework like AP and International Baccalaureate, are they succeeding in those courses? Are students coming to school? Chronic absenteeism, we know kids who miss significant amounts of the school year are more likely to be retained in grade, more likely to drop out. States can now pay attention to that in their accountability system. They can look at post-secondary outcomes. How are students doing in college or the workforce over time? Right, so there is this ability to broaden the definition of educational excellence, I think is an important opportunity that ESSA creates. 2, ESSA creates an opportunity to try to tackle this teacher diversity issue in that states have a lot of flexibility with how they use Title II professional development dollars. There are some places around the country that are doing these grow your own programs that are intended to help diverse high school and college students choose teaching. Majority of our kids, I mentioned in our public schools, are kids of color. Only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. Only 2% of our teachers are African-American men. We have a lot of work to do in this space, but states are positioned to be able to do it. And then third, sort of ending on a note of bipartisan consensus, ESSA includes an innovation fund that is designed to encourage innovation with evaluation that will give us good data on what works. And there are a number of programs that were included in the most recent omnibus budget that have a similar focus, building the evidence base around strategies that make a difference so that the dollars we use are well spent. I take very seriously Nina's concern that we could just add dollars and then have them not produce an effect. But there is this bipartisan consensus that if we build good evidence around what works, we can make smarter investments. And that, I think, is a very hopeful possibility for the future of public policy.
Let's stop right
there.
That was good. Thank you all so much. Louise, Ted Duchess, John King, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.